Welcome to Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec podcast, with me, your host, Spec. This is a podcast where we talk through all of the pre-production that goes into making the theories that you see on the Lore by Spec channel and its associated channels. Let's get the shilling out of the way first. If you haven't gone and subscribed and liked and commented on the videos on Lore by Spec on the YouTube channel, please go ahead and do that now. That's one of the best ways that you can support me. This podcast is also available anywhere that you can find podcasts. So if you are listening, if you could like the podcast and maybe leave a little review, that does wonders for the algorithm on the podcast side, which really helps. And if you want to help support this podcast, this is the only one that currently doesn't use free tools. And since it's a paid thing, if you have the means to contribute to this, the link for this is in my description for my Ko-Fi. This helps me keep the light on and pay for all of the things that go into making this podcast a quality project. So for today's podcast, we're going to be delving into a series of conversations about Ven. So if Ven is not your favorite character, I fear that the next few podcasts are going to be largely focused around him, given the ramble that we went on last episode about his triangle connection between Roxas and Ventus, and that has sadly led me to go down rabbit hole as to his criteria as being Princess of Heart. So why Ventus was never a Princess of Heart is a confusing one, and I don't necessarily know why he hasn't been in the same leagues or the same criteria as the Princess of Heart, because the character files and others describe them as being women with the absence of darkness, who have no darkness within them. And the only thing that I can kind of come up with as to why Ven wouldn't fit that criteria specifically is that he's a guy, firstly. But then why wouldn't he be a Prince of Heart then, if he still fits the same criteria? And does it inherently matter whether or not that gender is the specific criteria here, like the determining factor? Because we can't even go so far as to say, oh, well, he's a Keyblade wielder, and therefore he can't be a Princess of Heart, when Kyrie, we know, is a Keyblade wielder and a Princess of Heart. So that doesn't track in terms of that logic, because he fits the light over darkness kind of profile. So we need to kind of look at why the series specifically excludes him and kind of think about what that means more outside of a surface level plot thing. Because I feel like this is one of those things for the franchise that nobody ever really looked too hard into, and therefore, as a result, we're not going to get many satisfactory answers about it. It's much like the same way for Kingdom Hearts 3, that it was sort of arbitrary, right? That the Princesses of Heart just so happened to be shifted onto a new set of princesses. We never really get a solid or a decent explanation there as to why that's happened, why the powers would suddenly be shifted or changed from people, considering that we know that Aurora, Cinderella, Snow White. Like, everybody became whole post Kingdom Hearts 1, so there's no reason to assume that they wouldn't exist in this specific timeline anymore. And the game is kind of hand wavy about explaining that. It's more like, yeah, well, here's your new set of people who you need to save. And it's funny because Kingdom Hearts 1 did such a good job of integrating each of the princesses into their specific narratives for each of their plots in Kingdom Hearts 1. Like, Sora talks to Yasmin about saving Aladdin. Not in so much as there is meddling happening in Kingdom Hearts 1, but there's a connection there between Sora and Co. and the respective princesses. Like, if you think about the scene in Hollow Bastion when Maleficent dies, but that dark presence is spawned, and all of the seven princesses are like, yeah, we're just holding the darkness at bay. But everybody turns to talk to Sora. Everybody's aware of who Sora is in this present moment in time. They're all very kind of aware and engaged. You think of Belle in Beast's castle, and like, they talk to Sora, they engage with Sora, they are friends with Sora. There's no connection at all to the same degree in Kingdom Hearts 3 with the with the new princesses. In fact, by and large, Sora has very little to do with those princesses. For example, Sora interacts more with Eugene than he does with Rapunzel. The same with, you know, what in Arendelle sort of runs after Anna a lot. Elsa wants nothing to do with Sora. And then there's this whole building Olaf together scene, which is where we have like maybe one conversation with Anna. There's no kind of connection or a sense of them working together in the same way that you see, like, maybe Mulan in Kingdom Hearts 2, working together. And I know that she's not necessarily a princess in that regard, but we get far more involved in the worlds than it just being the story still plays out. Because by and large, and I think that this is what they were going for in 3, that the story would still play out regardless of Sora's presence in the world. But if that's the case, wouldn't it be far more appropriate or interesting in 3 that we would tie that back to something more tangible, something that we already have experience with? Wouldn't it have been far more interesting that the reason why the current Keyblade stuff couldn't happen is because Ven's still asleep because he's a princess? Or a prince of heart, essentially? Like, because then we have skin in the game with that point. Because I think of some other worlds in Kingdom Hearts 3, like Pirates and San Fernocchio and Monsters Inc., or Monstropolis, where I'm like, what are we doing here to kind of further the plot? I understand that that we have bits of each, where in Monsters Inc., for example, we have the whole Ventus, or the whole Vanitas stuff, where Sully yeets him into a door. And in Pirates, we have what is essentially a conversation about a box. I'm not really sure outside of that, though, what we're doing there, per se. And I think it would have been far more interesting that we would have some sort of tie-in to gaining the other guardians through similar means. Reminder did a really good job of, like, in order to get Kyrie back or through the loop of going back in time, we needed to get everybody's souls back. Why couldn't it have been something along those lines that tied it to each of the worlds so we all felt more invested? That would have been pretty cool, I think. Probably would have been far more interesting, too, as an idea and as a concept. But it also has interesting implications of then being a princess of heart or not being classified as one, because we aren't entirely sure how far back that goes. We know that Ven was ultimately picked up by Xehanort post Union Cross, and then having his light and darkness separated from him. It's something I've mentioned before in other theories that we don't really know why Ven, of all people, to get picked up by Xehanort, because it kind of feels like there are better, arguably more interesting or more viable people for that to happen with, and not Ven. Marluxia feels like a far more obvious target to me for having his light and darkness successfully uh, separated from one to another. So we never really understand why then, but what we do know is that pure separation seemed to have happened in Birth by Sleep and not earlier. Though we can't really ever confirm this because we don't have the information. But it is a nice thought experiment that what if, like, what are we determining as an absence of darkness? Because Belle is meant to be one who is absent of darkness, but yet we've seen her do things that could be considered to be dark adjacent depending on what day of the week it is. Is her necessarily chastising the beast or taking his rose or whatever? Is that not an indicator of some sort of darkness in this world? Like IRL, obviously not, but in the blanket of Kingdom Hearts, could it, I don't know, could it be considered that, I guess the more fundamental question to then not being considered a prince of darkness or a princess of heart is what are we classifying this as? Because we don't really know. We're never really told. Like, if Elsa is meant to be considered one of the new princesses of heart because she has an absence of darkness within her, how is shunning her entire, like, her whole arc, how is that not illustrative of some darkness? Right? That doesn't necessarily make sense to me, that you could essentially run away from your duties because you're stressed out, can't control your magical abilities, and then accidentally murder your sister. And that somehow still qualifies you as having a Princess of Hearts status? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And yet you look at Ven, in comparison, who is certainly has, by hook or by crook, the absence of darkness, and yet somehow she is able to have the title and he doesn't? I'm not sure. I'm not sure how I feel about that, how that maths in my brain, because I don't think it does. There's something very confusing about the people that they chose for this. It's a similar thing with Rapunzel. Do we determine Mother Grothel's abuse of Rapunzel to be, and for Rapunzel to then act out, for that to just be kind of, that to be okay too. Is her running away from the tower and disobeying her mother, is that a princess trait of being pure of heart in this context, in this universe? Because we certainly don't see Yasmin or Snow White or Belle or any of the other traditional princesses, Cinderella, etc., Aurora. We don't see them do any of the stereotypical same things as our modern princesses do, who are arguably more complex. And the problem with adding that complexity is that the princess of Harsh Monk here is very descript. It is the absence of darkness. In many ways, it's very specific. And yet, Ven doesn't qualify. So it's an interesting thought experiment to kind of sit with, to be like, who is making these rules and how exactly do we end up knowing that these powers get transferred in general from one to another? Like, how did we end up with Yen Sid and Mickey being like, oh yeah, this is just a new bunch now, so we don't have to worry about it anymore? Like where did you get that? Where did you get that release update from? Like, where was that press release? Who told you? Like what database gets updated to let you know who does and doesn't suddenly fit a criteria? Where's the maths done on that? Because I want to see. I want to know. Because, and of course don't get me wrong, I'm being quite hyperbolic. I am aware that there has to be a certain amount of hand-waving when it comes to fictional narrative, right? I'm not delusional. I am aware that there has to be a certain amount of wishy-washy hand-waviness that occurs with something like this. But that doesn't mean that just because it's a complex answer doesn't mean that we shouldn't get one. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't get one. It just means you might need to think harder about what specifically it means for people to hit those criteria. Because it could just be as simple as considering Ben's darkness got extracted. It doesn't qualify it because it has to be a naturally occurring light, right? It has to be something that you were innately born with and not something that was extracted from you or anything else. It has to purely be from something that you were given at birth, which would then be a satisfying answer as to why Ven doesn't fit that criteria. Or simply he doesn't fit that criteria because he's a dude. And that's a conversation for how we talk about gender and roles in Kingdom Hearts, which I think will eventually be an interesting conversation to have too. This has been Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec production with me, Spec. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me today. Just as a reminder, don't forget, if you haven't followed the Lore by Spec YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. It's free there. If you haven't taken the time to review the podcast or dropped a like and a comment, those really help too. And if you ever feel inclined to help me keep the lights on over here, head to Ko-Fi, which is in my description, to help support the podcast. Once again, thank you all so very much for listening, and I will see you all next time.